I stood in my empty wedding venue, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother's ice-cold words. "Enjoy marrying your plumber, we won't be embarrassed with you." The line went dead. Around me, my bride, Emma's family filled half the church, while my side remained completely vacant. My sister's wedding last year had cost my parents $80,000, a lavish affair with 300 guests. Today, they couldn't even be bothered to witness my vows. I looked at my phone, scrolled to a recent photo of my fiancé Jake, and hit send. Growing up as Spencer Richardson, I learned early that love in our family came with conditions. My older sister Madison had always been the shining star, the princess who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. While I struggled for scraps of attention, Madison basked in the constant glow of approval from our mother Elizabeth and father David. I remember being 8 years old, standing in the doorway of what should have been my bedroom, watching Madison redecorate the larger space our parents had given her instead. "Spencer needs less room," my mother had explained when I asked why Madison got the master bedroom on the second floor. "Madison has more activities, more friends coming over." Even then, I understood the unspoken message. Madison mattered more. The pattern continued through our childhood and into adulthood. Madison's 16th birthday brought a brand new silver Lexus with a giant red bow. For my 16th, I received a lecture about responsibility and a summer job at the local grocery store to save for my own transportation. Madison's high school graduation party filled our entire backyard with white tents and catered food. Mine was a dinner at Applebee's with immediate family only. When Madison announced her engagement 2 years ago during Sunday dinner, our parents transformed into wedding planners overnight. Within a week, they had visited 4 venues, hired a coordinator, and started discussing guest lists that exceeded 200 people. I watched my mother's eyes light up as she talked about the wedding of the century and giving Madison everything she deserves. Madison's fiancé, Brett, was everything our parents dreamed of: a junior partner at a prestigious law firm, graduate of an Ivy League school, member of the country club where our father played golf every weekend. Brett drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and spoke the language of success that our parents understood and worshipped. I had graduated summa cum laude from business school with a double major in finance and economics. But our parents barely made it to my graduation ceremony. They were too busy that weekend, finalizing Madison's engagement party details. When I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I scanned the audience and found them in the back row, my mother typing frantically on her phone while my father checked his watch repeatedly. The engagement party itself became a showcase of our family's priorities. Held at the exclusive Riverside Country Club, it featured live music, professional photography, and a guest list that read like a who's who of our city's social elite. Madison glowed in a designer dress that cost more than my monthly rent, while our parents worked the room like political candidates, making sure everyone knew about the upcoming event of the year. I met Jake Matthews on a Tuesday morning in October, when my apartment's water heater decided to flood my bathroom at 6 a.m. The property management company sent him over as an emergency repair, and he arrived carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes that had seen better days. But when he smiled and introduced himself, something shifted in my chest that I hadn't expected. Jake was different from anyone I had ever dated. He had calloused hands from honest work, an easy laugh that filled rooms naturally, and a way of looking at problems like they were puzzles to solve rather than crises to endure. While he fixed my water heater, we talked about everything from baseball to books, and I found myself hoping the repair would take longer than necessary. Our first official date was at a small diner called Murphy's that Jake had discovered during a renovation project downtown. The vinyl booths had been patched with duct tape, the coffee came in mismatched mugs, and the waitress called everyone honey or sweetie. It was the complete opposite of the upscale restaurants I was accustomed to. But Jake's enthusiasm for the place made it feel like the most important location in the world. "The owner Murphy makes everything from scratch," Jake explained, cutting into what he promised was the best meatloaf in 3 counties. "Has been here 30 years. Knows every regular customer's order by heart. This is real food made by real people." As I tasted the meatloaf, I realized Jake was right about more than just the quality. There was something authentic about the entire experience that I had been missing in my life. Over the following months, Jake introduced me to a world I never knew existed. He taught me to change my own oil, to identify different types of wood by their grain, to appreciate the satisfaction that comes from fixing something broken with your own hands. We spent weekends at hardware stores where Jake knew every employee by name, and evenings at his apartment where he would show me projects he was working on for friends and neighbors. I didn't tell my parents about Jake's profession initially. I simply mentioned that I had met someone special. Someone who made me laugh and challenged me to see the world differently. My mother's immediate questions focused on his education, his family background, his career prospects. When I deflected with vague answers about him being in construction, she seemed satisfied enough to move on to more pressing topics like Madison's wedding venue selection. The Sunday dinner where I finally introduced Jake to my parents remains etched in my memory like a scar. I had spent the entire week preparing Jake for the experience, explaining my family's particular brand of formality and their tendency to evaluate people like business acquisitions. Jake had borrowed a dress shirt from his brother and arrived with flowers for my mother, a bottle of wine for my father, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from wanting to make a good impression. For the first 30 minutes, everything went smoothly. Jake complimented my mother's cooking, discussed current events with my father, and even made Madison laugh with a story about a construction mishap. But then my father, in his typical interrogation style, began probing deeper into Jake's background and career plans. "So Jake, what exactly do you do in construction?" my father asked, setting down his fork with the precision of a lawyer preparing to cross-examine a witness. "I'm a plumber," Jake answered honestly, his voice steady and proud. "I work for a small company doing residential and commercial repairs, some new construction installations." The temperature in the dining room dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. My mother's smile froze in place like a photograph, while my father's eyebrows rose with poorly concealed dismay. Madison suddenly became fascinated with her salad, and I felt my stomach clench with the familiar dread of family disapproval. "How practical," my mother managed, her voice taking on the tone she typically reserved for discussing unpleasant medical procedures. The conversation limped along for another 20 minutes before my parents began making transparent excuses about early morning meetings and sudden headaches. As we said our goodbyes in the foyer, my father pulled me aside with the kind of firm grip that suggested the conversation was not optional. "Son, you're 32 years old. Don't you think it's time to settle down with someone more compatible with your background?" The words hit me like a slap, made worse by the fact that Jake was standing close enough to hear every syllable. The drive back to Jake's apartment was quiet, filled with the kind of tension that comes from unspoken hurts and damaged pride. When we finally talked about the evening, Jake's response surprised me with its grace. "Spencer, I've been judged for what I do my whole life. People see the work clothes and assume they know everything about me. I hoped your family might be different, but I understand their concerns. I just hope you don't share them." That night, lying in Jake's bed listening to him sleep peacefully beside me, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I had to choose between my family's approval and my own happiness. The choice felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Madison's wedding planning consumed our family like a beautiful, expensive wildfire. My mother Elizabeth quit her part-time position at the art gallery to focus exclusively on what she called the event of a lifetime. Every conversation at family dinners revolved around floral arrangements, catering menus, guest accommodations, and the endless parade of vendors competing for the privilege of contributing to Madison's perfect day. The budget for Madison's wedding grew weekly, expanding from the initial $50,000 to an eventual total that exceeded $80,000. My father David, typically careful with money, signed checks without question when they related to Madison's happiness. The wedding dress alone cost $8,000 more than I had paid for my first car and came from a boutique in New York where Madison spent an entire weekend shopping with our mother and 3 bridesmaids. I became an unwilling expert in wedding vendor pricing during those months. The florist charged $12,000 for arrangements that would last a single day. The photographer cost $15,000 for a package that included engagement photos, bridal portraits, wedding day coverage, and a custom leather album. The venue required a $20,000 deposit just to reserve the date, with additional charges for linens, lighting, security, and service staff. Madison's bridal shower took place at the country club, featuring personalized invitations printed on handmade paper, a champagne fountain, and party favors that cost more per guest than most people spend on entire birthday celebrations. I watched my mother coordinate every detail with the precision of a military operation, her face glowing with pride as Madison opened gifts and posed for professional photographs. The bachelor and bachelorette parties were equally elaborate affairs, Madison and her wedding party flew to Napa Valley for a weekend of wine tasting, spa treatments, and private dinners at restaurants that required reservations months in advance. Brett's groomsmen organized a golf trip to Scottsdale that included luxury accommodations, championship courses, and enough premium alcohol to stock a small bar. My role in Madison's wedding was carefully defined and severely limited. I was assigned the task of designing programs and coordinating transportation for out-of-town relatives, important enough to justify my involvement, but peripheral enough to keep me from interfering with the real decisions. During cake tastings and menu selections, I found myself relegated to carrying shopping bags and offering opinions that were politely acknowledged and completely ignored. The actual wedding exceeded every expectation Madison and our parents had set. 300 guests attended the ceremony at St. Augustine Cathedral, followed by a reception at the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel. Madison looked stunning in her custom gown. Brett was handsome in his designer tuxedo, and our parents beamed with satisfaction as they welcomed congratulations from friends and business associates. I spent most of Madison's wedding feeling like a well-dressed stranger at someone else's celebration. During the father-daughter dance, I watched our father David hold Madison with the kind of tender pride I had never seen directed toward me. During the toasts, speakers praised Madison's beauty, intelligence, and promising future with Brett, while I sat at a table with distant relatives who struggled to remember my name. When Jake and I announced our engagement 6 months later, the contrast was immediate and heartbreaking. My mother's first reaction was not congratulations or excitement, but a practical question about budget constraints. "How much do you expect this to cost us?" she asked, her tone suggesting that my happiness was primarily a financial burden to be managed, rather than a joy to be celebrated. My father's response was equally telling. When I mentioned wanting a small, meaningful ceremony, he actually seemed relieved rather than disappointed. Good. After Madison's wedding, we need to be more practical about these things, he said, missing entirely the fact that his relief felt like a rejection of everything Jake and I wanted to celebrate. Jake and I spent weeks visiting venues that fit our modest budget and intimate vision. We found a small historic chapel called Riverside Community Church that had been built in 1923 and still retained its original stained glass windows and hardwood floors. The sanctuary could accommodate 75 people comfortably, and the rental fee was reasonable enough that we could afford it without asking our parents for financial assistance. The difference between our families' responses to our wedding planning became painfully obvious during our first and only joint meeting. Jake's mother Helen arrived with a notebook full of ideas, homemade cookies for everyone to share, and genuine excitement about celebrating our love. Jake's father Tom brought estimates from friends in the catering business and offered to help with setup and coordination on the wedding day. My parents arrived 20 minutes late, distracted by a phone call about Madison's first anniversary party planning, and spent the entire meeting checking their phones and making subtle suggestions that we consider postponing until things were more settled. When Jake's family offered to host the rehearsal dinner at their family property, my mother's polite acceptance carried undertones of resignation rather than gratitude. The contrast became even more stark when we discussed guest lists and accommodations. Jake's extended family began making travel arrangements immediately, with aunts and uncles calling to discuss what they could contribute to make our day special. His childhood friends from trade school and work started planning bachelor party festivities that involved camping, fishing, and the kind of genuine male bonding that had nothing to do with expensive entertainment. My family's response was markedly different. Madison was too busy with her new marriage and junior league commitments to serve as a bridesmaid. My parents' friends received invitations, but responded with regrets and generic gifts ordered online. The few relatives who planned to attend did so with the obligation-fulfilling enthusiasm typically reserved for distant cousins' funerals. 2 weeks before the wedding, I overheard my parents discussing our celebration during a phone conversation with my Aunt Patricia that they assumed I could not hear. "It's embarrassing, really," my mother said, her voice carrying the tone of someone discussing a mild social scandal. "After the beautiful wedding we gave Madison, now this situation with Spencer and his plumber." My father's voice joined the conversation with equal dismissal. "We might just say we're traveling that weekend. Elizabeth's headaches have been terrible lately, and you know how these small ceremonies can be." Awkward. Standing in the hallway outside their bedroom, listening to my parents plan to abandon my wedding day, I felt something break inside my chest that had been cracking for months. The realization that they would rather invent excuses than celebrate my happiness confirmed everything I had suspected about my place in their hierarchy of love and priorities. That night, I called Jake and tried to explain what I had heard without letting the pain seep too deeply into my voice. His response was characteristically direct and supportive. "Spencer, if they don't want to be there, that's their loss. We're building something beautiful together, and the people who matter will be there to celebrate with us." Jake's family, meanwhile, had transformed our small wedding into a community celebration. His brothers Kevin and Paul took vacation days to help with setup and coordination. His grandmother Anna flew in from Portland, despite her 87 years and arthritis. His childhood pastor, Father Michael, offered to perform the ceremony at no charge, because Jake had spent countless volunteer hours helping with church maintenance and community service projects. The week before our wedding, while my parents found increasingly creative excuses to avoid final preparations, Jake's mother Helen called me every evening to coordinate details and ask if there was anything else she could do to make our day perfect. "Spencer, honey," she said during one of those calls, "you're gaining a family who will love and support you no matter what. That's the real gift here." As our wedding day approached, the contrast between our family's investment in our happiness could not have been more obvious. Jake's side was treating our celebration like the important life milestone it was supposed to be. My parents were treating it like a minor social obligation they were hoping to avoid. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes promises of new beginnings feel achievable. I woke up in my apartment at 7 a.m., expecting to find missed calls from my parents, asking about timing, directions, or last-minute details. Instead, my phone showed 3 messages from Jake's family members, confirming arrival times and offering assistance, but nothing from the people who had raised me. Jake's family had turned wedding preparation into a joyful community effort. His older brother Kevin arrived at 8:30 carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches from a local deli, along with a borrowed van to transport decorations and equipment to the church. His younger brother Paul showed up 30 minutes later with his toolkit and an eagerness to help with any setup challenges that might arise. Jake's mother Helen brought homemade wedding favors she had been crafting for weeks, small burlap bags filled with wildflower seeds and tied with ribbon that matched our wedding colors. Each bag included a handwritten note saying, "Plant these seeds and watch love grow," signed with her careful cursive handwriting. The personal touch and obvious care she had invested made me understand what genuine family support looked like. The contrast with my own family's involvement was becoming impossible to ignore. I tried calling my parents at 9 a.m., expecting to coordinate our arrival times at the church. The call went straight to voicemail, and my mother's recorded voice cheerfully suggested leaving a detailed message for a prompt response that never came. Jake found me staring at my phone in the kitchen, probably wearing the expression of someone who was trying not to acknowledge obvious rejection. "Hey," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. "Today is about us, remember? Everything else is just background noise." His father Tom arrived at 10 a.m. wearing his best suit and carrying a garment bag with Jake's wedding attire, which had been professionally pressed and prepared by Jake's Aunt Sarah, who owned a dry cleaning business downtown. Tom had also brought a small wooden box containing cufflinks that had belonged to Jake's grandfather, the same cufflinks Tom had worn at his own wedding 35 years earlier. "Son," Tom said to me, using the word with the natural warmth that my own father had never managed. "These have been in our family for 60 years. Jake's grandfather wore them when he married Jake's grandmother. I wore them when I married Helen, and would be honored if Jake wore them today." The gesture moved me more than I expected, partly because of its genuine sentiment, and partly because it highlighted the absence of any similar tradition or support from my own family. My parents had never offered meaningful heirlooms or shared family history with the same natural generosity. By 11 a.m., I was becoming genuinely concerned about my parents' whereabouts. I called my mother's cell phone again, and this time she answered with the distracted tone of someone juggling multiple priorities. "Spencer, we're running late," she said without preamble. "There's a situation with Madison's new apartment. The moving company damaged some furniture, and we're dealing with insurance claims." "Mom, the wedding starts at 2 o'clock, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The rehearsal dinner is tonight at 6. We went over this timeline last week." Yes, I know," she replied impatiently. "Well, try to make it. but your father is handling the insurance adjuster, and you know how these things can drag on. Maybe start without us, if we're not there exactly on time." The casual dismissal in her voice made my stomach clench with familiar disappointment. Madison's furniture crisis was apparently more pressing than my wedding ceremony, a priority ranking that told me everything about where I stood in my family's attention and care. At noon, I tried calling my father directly. He answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear traffic noise in the background suggesting he was driving somewhere that was not the church where his son was getting married in 2 hours. "Dad, where are you?" I asked, abandoning any attempt at polite conversation. "Son, well, try to make it. But your mother has a terrible headache, and this situation with Madison's apartment has become quite complicated," he said, echoing my mother's earlier excuse with additional elaboration that made it sound more legitimate without making it more convincing. At Riverside Community Church, the contrast between our family's investment in the day became visually obvious. Jake's side of the chapel was filling with genuine warmth and excitement. His grandmother Anna sat in the front row wearing her best dress and a corsage that Helen had made specially for her. His childhood friends from trade school had arrived early and were helping arrange flowers and adjust lighting with the easy competence of people accustomed to solving practical problems. Jake's co-workers from Matthews Plumbing had closed the business early so everyone could attend, and they filled 2 entire pews wearing their Sunday best and talking excitedly about Jake's happiness. His uncle Robert, who served as a volunteer firefighter, had coordinated with the church to ensure proper parking and logistics for our 75 guests. My side of the chapel looked markedly different. 3 cousins I saw only at major holidays sat together in the third row, checking their phones and making polite conversation that suggested obligation rather than enthusiasm. My college roommate Derek had driven down from Seattle, and I was grateful for his presence even though we had barely spoken in the past 3 years. The most touching presence on my side was Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor who had insisted on attending despite barely knowing Jake and having no obligation to involve herself in my personal celebration. She sat in the second row wearing a lovely blue dress and holding a small wrapped gift that she had clearly chosen with care. Jake's sister Emma had volunteered to serve as our unofficial wedding coordinator, and she moved through the church with the kind of organized efficiency that comes from genuinely caring about the outcome. She adjusted decorations, coordinated with the photographer, and checked on details with the thorough attention usually reserved for family members. "Spencer," Emma said, finding me in the small preparation room behind the altar, "Tom wanted me to ask if you'd like him to walk you down the aisle. He knows your father isn't here yet, and he'd consider it an honor if you'd let him stand in." The offer was made with such natural kindness that I almost started crying, right there in my wedding suit. Tom had known me for less than a year, but he was offering to fill a role that my own father was apparently too busy to prioritize. At 1:30, 30 minutes before our ceremony was scheduled to begin, I made what I hoped would be my final attempt to reach my parents. I called my mother's phone with the desperate hope that they were simply running late rather than deliberately absent. When she answered, her voice carried the exasperated tone of someone dealing with minor interruptions. "Spencer, I told you we're dealing with Madison's insurance situation. This is quite complicated, and we can't just abandon her when she needs our support." "Mom, this is my wedding day," I said, the words coming out with more pain than I had intended to reveal. "I need your support too." There was a pause that stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat in my ears. When my mother spoke again, her voice had turned cold with the kind of dismissive finality that I recognized from childhood arguments that I had never been allowed to win. "Spencer, enjoy marrying your plumber. We won't be embarrassed with you." The line went dead, and I stood alone in the preparation room holding my phone like evidence of a crime that had just been committed against my heart. The words hit me with physical force, confirming every fear I had harbored about my parents' true feelings regarding Jake and our relationship. Jake appeared in the doorway at that exact moment, probably alerted by Emma that something was wrong. He took one look at my face and stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with the gentle care of someone handling something fragile. "Whatever just happened," he said, taking my hands in his calloused ones, "it doesn't change anything about what we're doing here today. You're about to marry someone who loves you completely, in front of people who are genuinely happy for us. That's what matters." Standing there in that small church room, looking at Jake in his perfectly fitted suit with his grandfather's cufflinks and his father's proud smile, I realized that my parents' absence was not the tragedy I had feared it would be. Instead, it was clarity about what kind of family I was choosing to build versus what kind of family I was leaving behind. Father Michael knocked gently on the door to let us know it was time to begin. As Jake and I walked toward the altar together, I looked out at the gathered faces and saw something my parents would never understand, a room full of people who were there because they genuinely wanted to celebrate love, commitment, and the beginning of something beautiful. Standing at the altar next to Jake, surrounded by people who had chosen to celebrate our love despite my parents' absence, I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. The pain of my family's rejection was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was being gradually replaced by something else, a recognition of what real family support actually looked like. Father Michael, Jake's childhood pastor, began the ceremony with words that seemed crafted specifically for our situation. "Marriage is not just the joining of two people," he said, his warm voice carrying across the small chapel. "It's the creation of a new family built on love, respect, and commitment." Today, Jake and Spencer are not just making promises to each other, they're choosing the kind of family they want to create together. As we exchanged vows, I looked into Jake's eyes and saw something I had been searching for my entire life, without realizing it: unconditional acceptance and love that didn't come with conditions or requirements for social advancement. Jake's promises to me were simple and direct: to support my dreams, to be honest in our communication, to build something together that would last longer than either of us individually. My own vows surprised me with their emotional honesty. Looking at Jake, I promised to value him for who he was rather than what he could provide, to support his work and his family with the same loyalty he had shown mine, and to choose him every day regardless of what anyone else thought about our choices. When Father Michael pronounced us married and Jake kissed me with joyful enthusiasm, the small congregation erupted in genuine celebration. Jake's grandmother Anna wiped tears from her eyes while applauding enthusiastically. His brothers Kevin and Paul whistled and cheered with the unrestrained happiness of people who had watched their brother find genuine love. The reception took place at Tom and Helen's property, a beautiful 10-acre spread about 20 minutes outside town that they had been developing slowly over the past 15 years. Helen had spent weeks preparing the outdoor space, stringing lights between mature oak trees, and creating a dance floor on the level area behind their farmhouse-style home. The contrast between this celebration and Madison's elaborate country club reception could not have been more striking, but the difference was entirely in our favor. While Madison's wedding had felt like a social performance designed to impress acquaintances and business associates, our reception felt like a genuine community gathering, where everyone present had chosen to be there out of love and support. Jake's Uncle Robert had barbecued brisket and ribs using a recipe that had been in their family for 3 generations. Helen and her sisters had prepared side dishes that filled 2 long tables with homemade comfort food that actually tasted like it was made with care rather than ordered from expensive caterers who specialized in presentation over flavor. During the dinner, I watched Jake interact with his extended family and began to notice details that I had overlooked during our courtship. His cousin Mark, who I had assumed was simply another tradesman, was actually describing a commercial development project he was managing downtown. Jake's Aunt Sarah mentioned expanding her dry cleaning business to include a second location, and Jake offered insights about commercial real estate markets that suggested knowledge beyond typical plumbing expertise. Jake's youngest brother Paul talked enthusiastically about finishing his engineering degree while working for the family business, and Jake responded with questions about structural specifications and building codes that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone whose education I had assumed ended with high school and trade certification. As the evening progressed, I began to realize that I had made assumptions about Jake's background and family situation that were probably incomplete. The Matthews family clearly had resources and connections that extended beyond what I had understood, but they wore their success with the kind of genuine humility that made it easy to overlook. The photographer Jake's family had hired his cousin Lisa, who apparently ran a successful freelance business specializing in weddings and family portraits, captured a particularly perfect moment during the reception. Jake had noticed that one of the string lights had come loose and was hanging awkwardly above the dance area. Without thinking twice, he grabbed a ladder from his father's workshop and climbed up to fix the problem, still wearing his wedding suit and looking completely comfortable solving practical problems at his own celebration. Lisa caught the moment when Jake was adjusting the light, his face concentrated on the task, but also showing the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows how to fix things that are broken. In the photo, Jake looked handsome and confident, but also capable and grounded in a way that spoke to deeper qualities than simple physical attraction. Looking at that photo later, I realized it captured everything about Jake that I had fallen in love with: his willingness to take care of problems without being asked, his complete lack of self-consciousness about doing necessary work regardless of the setting, and his natural leadership style that made people want to follow his example rather than simply follow his orders. Something about that image made me think about my parents' rejection and their shallow assessment of Jake's worth based solely on his job title. They had dismissed him as just a plumber without taking time to understand who he actually was as a person or what he might represent beyond their limited understanding of success and social status. On impulse, I asked Lisa to send me that particular photo immediately. I wanted to share it with my parents, not to prove anything or to seek their approval, but to show them what they had chosen to miss by prioritizing social appearances over genuine character. I selected the photo in my phone and typed a simple message: no explanation, no apology, no request for reconciliation. Just the image of my new husband looking confident and capable at our wedding reception, surrounded by people who loved and respected him for who he was rather than what he owned. I hit send and placed my phone in my jacket pocket, then returned my attention to the celebration that was happening around me. Jake's grandmother Anna was teaching several of the younger cousins a traditional dance that involved more laughing than actual coordination. Tom was telling stories about Jake's childhood that made everyone laugh, including tales of a 10-year-old Jake who had insisted on helping his grandfather repair fences and fix equipment despite being barely tall enough to hold the tools properly. Within minutes of sending the photo, my phone began buzzing with incoming calls. I ignored the first few, assuming they were social media notifications or work-related messages that could wait until after our honeymoon. But when the calls continued with increasing frequency, Jake noticed my distraction and suggested I check to make sure there wasn't some kind of emergency. The missed calls were all from my parents: 7 from my mother, 4 from my father, and 3 from Madison, who never called me unless she needed something specific. The voicemails started playing automatically when I checked my messages, and my mother's voice came through with a tone I had never heard before: frantic, almost panicked. "Spencer, where are you? We need to talk immediately. Call me back right now. This is urgent." The second message was from my father, equally desperate but trying to sound more controlled. "Son, we need to have a conversation about your husband. Please call us as soon as you get this message. There's been a misunderstanding." Madison's message was the most revealing. "Spencer, Mom and Dad are completely freaking out. They spent the last 2 hours on the internet looking up something about Jake's family. You need to call them back before they have complete nervous breakdowns." Looking at my phone, buzzing with continued incoming calls from my parents who had dismissed my wedding as an embarrassment just hours earlier, I began to understand that my simple photo had revealed something about Jake that changed their entire perspective on our relationship. Jake noticed my confusion and the obvious distress in my parents' messages. "Spencer, what's going on? Is everything okay?" I showed him the flood of missed calls and desperate voicemails from my family. They saw the photo I sent them, and now they're acting like something urgent has happened. I don't understand what could have changed. Jake looked at the phone, then at me, with an expression that suggested he understood something that I had not yet figured out. "Spencer, there's something about my family that we should probably talk about." I was planning to explain everything after we got back from our honeymoon, but maybe this isn't the right time to wait. Standing in the middle of our wedding reception, surrounded by Jake's extended family who were dancing and laughing and celebrating our happiness, I realized that I was about to learn something about my new husband that would explain my parents' sudden panic and probably change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about the man I had just married. My phone continued buzzing with increasing desperation as Jake guided me away from the reception guests to a quiet corner of the property where we could talk privately. The urgency in my parents' repeated calls was unlike anything I had experienced before. Even Madison's various crises had never generated this level of frantic contact. "Jake," I said, holding my phone as it rang for the 12th time in 15 minutes. "What exactly do you think my parents discovered that's making them panic like this?" Jake ran his hand through his hair with the nervous gesture I had learned to recognize when he was preparing to discuss something important. "Spencer, I need to tell you some things about my family that I probably should have explained sooner. I was waiting for the right time, but it seems like that decision has been made for me." Before Jake could continue, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother, and something in Jake's expression suggested I should answer it. When I hit the accept button, my mother's voice came through with barely controlled hysteria. Spencer, thank God. Where are you? We need to talk immediately. Is your husband? Is he Jake Matthews? As in Matthews Construction and Development. My confusion must have been obvious to Jake, because he nodded grimly and gestured that I should continue the conversation while he prepared to fill in details that I was clearly missing. Mom. Yes, his name is Jake Matthews. What does that have to do with anything? You've known his name for months. Spencer, honey, my mother said, and her voice had transformed completely from the cold dismissal of this morning to something approaching desperate pleading. We need to meet with you and Jake immediately. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. We had no idea. We didn't realize who he was. My father's voice joined the call, apparently on speakerphone, with the kind of controlled panic that suggested he was trying to manage a crisis of significant proportions. Son, Matthews Construction and Development is one of the largest privately owned construction companies in the Pacific Northwest. We've been trying to get a meeting with the Matthews family for months about potential business partnerships. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because of what they revealed about Jake's family, but because of what they revealed about my parents' values. They had spent months trying to network with the Matthews family while simultaneously rejecting that very family when they met Jake in person. Jake was watching my face carefully as the conversation continued, probably reading my expression to gauge how much additional explanation I was going to need. When I looked at him with obvious bewilderment, he began filling in the details that my parents were frantically trying to communicate. Spencer, Jake said quietly while my parents continued talking over each other on the phone. My family owns Matthews Construction and Development. My father, Tom, is Thomas Matthews, and my grandfather started the company 60 years ago, building residential developments throughout Oregon and Washington. As Jake spoke, my parents' voices became increasingly desperate on the phone. My mother was explaining their research process. After seeing the wedding photo, they had spent hours on the internet trying to find information about Jake Matthews, and had eventually discovered that Matthews Construction had built several major shopping centers and residential developments throughout our region. The company's annual revenue exceeds $50 million, my father was saying, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was recalculating everything he thought he understood about a situation. They've been building major commercial and residential projects for 3 decades. We had no idea Jake was part of that family. Jake continued his explanation while my parents talked frantically in the background. I have an MBA from University of Washington, and I'm being prepared to take over significant portions of the company over the next few years. But I chose to start by learning every aspect of the business from the ground up, including plumbing, electrical work, and hands-on construction. The irony of the situation was becoming painfully clear. My parents had rejected Jake for being just a plumber, while simultaneously trying to gain access to his family's business empire through their own professional networks. They had dismissed him as socially unsuitable while pursuing business relationships with his father and grandfather. Spencer, my mother's voice interrupted Jake's explanation. We found out that Matthews Construction built Willowbrook Estates. That's our neighborhood. The company built our house, the country club, most of the shopping centers where we shop. We've been living in properties developed by Jake's family for 15 years. My father's voice joined with additional humiliating details. I've been leaving voicemails with Thomas Matthews' office for 6 months, trying to schedule a meeting about potential real estate investments. I never realized that Jake's father was the Thomas Matthews I was trying to reach for business partnerships. Jake's expression was a mixture of amusement and sympathy as he listened to my parents' frantic explanations. Spencer, this is exactly why I don't lead with information about my family's business when I meet new people. I've learned that it changes how people treat me, and not always in ways that are genuine or healthy. As my parents continued their increasingly desperate attempts to explain their mistake and arrange an immediate meeting, I began to understand the full scope of their misjudgment. They had evaluated Jake based on job titles and social appearances while completely missing his actual background, education, and family connections. The worst part, my mother was saying, is that we could have been building a relationship with the Matthews family this entire time. Instead, we said those terrible things this morning, and now they probably think we're awful people. Mom, I interrupted, finding my voice for the first time since this conversation began. You are awful people. You abandoned my wedding because you were embarrassed by my husband's profession. You didn't reject Jake because of his family's bank account, you rejected him because you thought he was beneath your social status. Jake squeezed my hand supportively as I continued the conversation with my parents, who were now frantically backpedaling and trying to arrange damage control for their morning's behavior. We want to make this right, my father was saying. We have wedding gifts for you both, and we'd love to host a proper reception to celebrate your marriage. Maybe we could meet with Jake's parents and discuss how our families might work together in the future. The transparent attempt at social climbing disguised as family reconciliation made my stomach turn with familiar disappointment. My parents were not apologizing for hurting me, they were apologizing for missing a business networking opportunity that they had finally discovered. Jake was watching my face as I processed the full implications of the conversation. When I looked at him questioningly, he nodded and gestured that we should probably continue this discussion in person rather than trying to resolve everything over the phone. "Well, call you back," I told my parents, ending the conversation before they could continue their increasingly frantic attempts to arrange immediate meetings and damage control for their behavior. Standing in the quiet corner of the Matthews family property, surrounded by the sounds of our wedding reception continuing in the background, I looked at my husband and realized that I had married someone whose background and future prospects exceeded anything my parents had ever imagined for Madison's husband, but whose character and values were what had actually attracted me in the first place. "Jake," I said, "how much about your family's business did you deliberately not tell me?" "Spencer," he replied, "I told you everything that mattered about who I am and what I value. The business details are just details. I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what my family owns." As we walked back toward our reception, I realized that my parents' panic was revealing something much more significant than simple social embarrassment. They had spent my entire life teaching me to value people based on wealth and social connections, but I had chosen Jake based on character and compatibility. Without realizing it, I had made the right choice for all the right reasons, while they had made the wrong choice for all the wrong reasons. Our wedding day was ending with a revelation that would change my relationship with my family forever, but it was also confirming that Jake and I had built our marriage on a foundation that could withstand any external pressures or family complications. The remainder of our wedding reception passed in a blur of mixed emotions, as Jake and I tried to process the implications of my parents' discovery, while still celebrating with the guests who had chosen to be there for genuine reasons. Jake's extended family continued their warm celebration, oblivious to the family drama unfolding through desperate phone calls and frantic voice messages. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and Jake's family had finished cleaning up the reception area, Jake and I sat together on the front porch of his childhood home and continued the conversation that my parents' panic attack had initiated. "Spencer," Jake said, settling into the wooden swing that his grandfather had built 30 years earlier, "I need you to understand why I chose not to lead with information about my family's business when we first started dating." I waited for him to continue, watching his face in the soft light from the porch lamp, and trying to reconcile the man I had fallen in love with over the past year with the business air my parents had discovered through their frantic internet research. When I was in college and business school, I dated several women who seemed genuinely interested in me until they learned about my family's company. Jake continued. The relationships would change overnight. Suddenly they wanted to meet my parents, attend business functions, and discuss future plans that involved them becoming part of the Matthews family empire, rather than part of my personal life. Jake explained that he had watched friends and potential partners disappear when they realized that his family's wealth came with expectations about social appearances, community involvement, and business networking that many people found overwhelming rather than attractive. The worst relationship ended when I discovered that my girlfriend had been researching my family's property holdings and business contracts without telling me, Jake said. She had been planning our entire future based on what she thought she could gain by marrying into the Matthews family, rather than what she actually felt about me as a person. As Jake shared more details about his background, I began to understand the complexity of his position within his family's business structure. He had graduated from University of Washington with dual degrees in business administration and civil engineering, then spent 2 years working on international construction projects to gain experience with large-scale development before returning to Oregon to begin his role in the family company. "I chose to start by learning every trade skill that our company employs," Jake explained. "My grandfather built this business with his own hands, and my father believes that everyone in the Matthews family should understand every aspect of construction before they're trusted with management or financial decisions." Jake's plumbing job was actually part of a comprehensive training program that had also included electrical work, carpentry, roofing, and equipment operation. Within the next 2 years, he would transition into project management and eventually business development, but his current hands-on experience was providing him with knowledge that would inform every major decision he made throughout his career. The ironic part, Jake said, is that your parents rejected me for being a plumber while simultaneously trying to access my family's business through their own professional networks. If they had taken time to get to know me instead of judging me based on job titles, they might have achieved their networking goals naturally through family relationships. The following morning, my parents began calling again with renewed desperation and increasingly elaborate plans for damage control. My mother wanted to host an immediate reception to properly celebrate our marriage, while my father was suggesting business meetings between our families to discuss potential partnership opportunities. Their transparent attempts to transform their rejection into networking opportunities revealed everything I needed to understand about their values and priorities. They were not apologizing for hurting me, they were apologizing for missing a social and business advancement opportunity that they had finally recognized. When Jake and I finally agreed to meet with my parents 3 days after our wedding, the conversation took place in their formal living room with an atmosphere that felt more like a business negotiation than a family reconciliation. My mother had prepared an elaborate presentation about her research into Matthew's construction, including printed articles about recent projects and community involvement initiatives. We had no idea about Jake's background, my mother began, her tone carrying the kind of apologetic enthusiasm that suggested she was hoping to turn embarrassment into opportunity. If we had known about his education and his family's business connections, we never would have reacted the way we did. Elizabeth, Jake interrupted gently, using my mother's first name with the kind of polite firmness that suggested he was about to establish important boundaries. You rejected me because you thought I was socially beneath your standards. You didn't reject me because of insufficient information about my bank account. My father attempted to redirect the conversation toward potential business collaborations. Jake, I've been trying to reach your father for months about real estate investment opportunities. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss ways our families might work together professionally. David, Jake replied, maintaining the same polite but firm tone. My family's business relationships are based on integrity, competence, and mutual respect. This conversation is about Spencer's relationship with his parents, not about networking opportunities for your investment portfolio. The interaction continued for over an hour, with my parents alternating between apologies for their wedding day behavior and transparent attempts to leverage our marriage into social and business advancement. Jake handled their approach with patient professionalism, but he also made clear that any future relationship would need to be based on genuine respect rather than opportunistic calculation. During the conversation, several details emerged that highlighted the extent of my parents' misjudgment. Matthew's construction had indeed built our family's neighborhood, along with the country club where Madison's wedding reception had been held, and several shopping centers where my parents conducted regular business. The building where David's law firm is located was designed and constructed by Matthew's Construction in 1998. Jake mentioned casually when my father continued pushing for business meetings. My grandfather supervised that project personally, and my father handled the legal and financial coordination. My parents had been indirectly benefiting from the Matthews family's business expertise for years, while simultaneously rejecting the Matthews family member who had chosen to love their son. Tom Matthews, Jake's father, demonstrated remarkable grace when my parents finally arranged to meet him formally. Rather than holding their earlier rejection against them, he focused on welcoming them as Spencer's family, while making clear that future relationships would need to be built on mutual respect rather than social climbing. Spencer chose our Jake for who he is as a person, Tom said during that first awkward family dinner, and Jake chose Spencer for the same reasons. That tells us everything we need to know about Spencer's character and values. Helen Matthews, Jake's mother, was equally gracious, but also subtly educational about the difference between wealth and character. We've been blessed with business success, she said, but we measure our success by the quality of people our children choose to love, not by the social connections those relationships might provide. The resolution of my parents' crisis required several weeks of careful boundary setting and gradual relationship rebuilding. Jake and I made clear that we welcomed genuine family support, but we would not tolerate attempts to use our marriage for social or business networking that had nothing to do with our actual happiness. My parents eventually learned to appreciate Jake for his character rather than his family connections, but the process required them to confront their own values and assumptions about success, relationships, and family priorities. Madison, surprisingly, became an unexpected ally in helping our parents understand their mistakes. Her own marriage to Brett was struggling with some of the same social pressure and superficial expectations that had characterized their elaborate wedding, and she began to recognize the value of relationships built on genuine compatibility rather than social appearances. 6 months after our wedding, Jake and I hosted our first anniversary celebration at the Matthews family property, and the transformation in family dynamics was remarkable. My parents attended the gathering with genuine enthusiasm rather than social obligation, having spent the intervening months learning to appreciate Jake for who he was, rather than what his family owned. The anniversary celebration became an opportunity to observe how different approaches to family relationships created different qualities of connection and support. Jake's extended family arrived with homemade contributions, offered to help with setup and coordination, and participated in the celebration with the kind of natural warmth that made everyone feel genuinely welcome. My parents' behavior had evolved significantly since their initial shock and desperate attempts at damage control. My mother Elizabeth brought a thoughtful gift that she had selected based on Jake's actual interests, rather than expensive items chosen to impress. My father David engaged in conversations about Jake's work and education, without constantly steering toward business networking opportunities. The most meaningful moment came when my father approached Jake privately and offered a genuine apology for his wedding day behavior and his initial assessment of Jake's character and prospects. "Jake," my father said, "I need to acknowledge that I judged you based on assumptions and social prejudices that had nothing to do with who you actually are. I'm embarrassed by my behavior, and I'm grateful that you've been patient with my family while we learned to do better." Jake's response demonstrated the kind of grace and maturity that had attracted me to him initially. "David, people make mistakes when they're operating from incomplete information or social pressure. What matters is that you're willing to recognize those mistakes and build something better moving forward." During the anniversary celebration, I had the opportunity to observe the contrast between Jake's family's approach to wealth and success versus my family's historical approach to the same topics. The Matthews family used their business success to support community projects, provide employment opportunities for local workers, and maintain strong connections with the working-class roots that had built their company. My parents' approach to success had always focused on social appearances, competitive consumption, and networking strategies designed to advance their own positions, rather than contribute to broader community welfare. Watching Jake's family operate, I began to understand why their wealth had brought them genuine satisfaction, while my parents' constant pursuit of social status had left them perpetually anxious and competitive. Madison's presence at the anniversary celebration revealed how much her own perspective had evolved since her elaborate wedding and the early months of her marriage to Brett. The social pressures and superficial expectations that had characterized their relationship were creating stress and disappointment that she was finally beginning to recognize and address. "Spencer," Madison said during a private conversation at the anniversary party, "watching you and Jake together has made me realize that I chose Brett for all the wrong reasons. You chose someone who makes you genuinely happy, while I chose someone who looked good on paper and impressed Mom and Dad." Madison's honesty about her own marriage helped explain why our parents had been so invested in creating an elaborate wedding celebration for her relationship while dismissing mine. They had been celebrating their own social success rather than Madison's personal happiness, just as they had rejected Jake based on social prejudices rather than his actual character or prospects. The anniversary celebration also provided an opportunity for me to reflect on the lessons I had learned about family relationships, personal values, and the difference between genuine success and social performance. My marriage to Jake had taught me to value character over social status, authentic connection over networking opportunities, and personal happiness over external approval. Jake's family had welcomed me with unconditional acceptance and support, while my own family had required months of education and boundary setting before they could appreciate the same relationship they had initially rejected. The contrast taught me important lessons about what kind of family environment I wanted to create for any future children Jake and I might have. Tom and Helen Matthews demonstrated throughout our first year of marriage that genuine family support involved celebrating authentic happiness rather than managing social appearances. They offered advice when asked, provided practical assistance when needed, and maintained strong emotional connections without attempting to control or manipulate relationship decisions. My parents gradually learned to operate from similar principles, but the learning process required them to confront their own assumptions about success, social status, and family priorities. The transformation was possible, but it required genuine commitment to change, rather than superficial adjustments designed to maintain access to social or business opportunities. 1 year after our wedding, my relationship with my parents had evolved into something healthier and more authentic than it had ever been during my childhood or young adulthood. They had learned to value my happiness over their social expectations, and they had developed genuine respect for Jake based on his character, rather than his family's business connections. The most satisfying aspect of this transformation was watching my parents begin to apply these lessons to other relationships and situations in their own lives. They became less focused on social climbing and more interested in building genuine connections with people they actually enjoyed spending time with, regardless of professional or social status. Looking back on our wedding day and the family crisis that followed, I realized that my parents' initial rejection had actually provided valuable clarity about the kind of relationships and family dynamics I wanted to prioritize in my own life. Their absence from our ceremony had been painful, but it had also highlighted the genuine support and love that Jake's family offered without conditions or social calculations. Jake and I built our marriage on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and authentic connection that proved strong enough to withstand external pressures and family complications. The social and financial advantages that came with joining the Matthews family were certainly welcome, but they were not the reason I had chosen Jake or the source of our relationship's strength and satisfaction. The life lesson that emerged from our experience was that true success in relationships comes from choosing people based on character, compatibility, and genuine affection, rather than social status, financial prospects, or external approval. My parents had initially failed this test, but they eventually learned to prioritize authentic connection over social performance. Today, Jake and I continue to build our life together with support from family members who appreciate us for who we are, rather than what we might provide for their own social or business advancement. We have learned to maintain healthy boundaries with people who attempt to use our relationship for purposes that have nothing to do with our actual happiness and well-being. The Matthews family business continues to provide opportunities for professional growth and community involvement, but Jake and I approach those opportunities as ways to contribute positively to our community, rather than as sources of social status or personal validation. Our marriage has taught me that the most valuable relationships are built on foundations of genuine love, mutual respect, and shared values rather than external circumstances or social calculations. When you choose someone for the right reasons, you create something that can withstand any external pressures or family complications that might arise. Have you ever had to choose between family approval and personal happiness in your own relationships? Sometimes the people who claim to love us most need to learn how to support our authentic choices rather than their social expectations. I'd love to hear your thoughts about navigating family pressure when it comes to major life decisions. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it encourages you to prioritize genuine connection over social performance in your own relationships. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real-life stories, share it with someone who might need to hear this message, and let me know in the comments how you've handled similar situations in your own life. Sometimes the most valuable lesson is learning that the family you choose can be just as important as the family you're born into.